Have you ever been surprised by something that you should have seen coming? In this episode, my guest Bruce Humes and I actually did that to each other. I surprised him by launching into an anecdote that began with a cat and ended with animistic, mournful song lyrics that I was quoting at him. Poor guy. He surprised me by suggesting that the main characters of this episode's novel, Last Quarter of the Moon, are actually better socialists than the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, themselves. Bruce did kind of have a point. These main characters, who are a tribe of reindeer herders called the Evenki, they certainly don't amass capital, put it like that. What they do is share. They give and take according to ability and need. And they have a sort of a gift and favour economy rather than a currency economy or a commodity economy, I suppose. And that brings me to my own point. I was actually thinking about this in the shower more than once, on more than one day. I was thinking how some podcasters in their kind of plugs about their Patreons or whatever will say something like, "This show is made possible by your generous donations." And that might be true for some podcasts that are taking in huge amounts of money, or the podcaster needs the moral support or something. But I think it's not something I can say, because it's just not true. The show is my gift to you. I measure its success by the happiness it creates. If I get nothing in return from it, I will not stop producing it. I don't use this show to pay my rent. It's something that I fit alongside my job and the freelance work I do. It's the job and the freelance work that pay the rent, not the podcast. Yeah, so that's the economic foundation of the podcast. If we're being good Marxists, that's what we should focus on and understand. So the reason I'm talking about all this is that if you get happiness or something similar from this show, and you'd like to give a gift in return, or return the favour, just like the Evenki might, here's 4 ways you can do so, and these are not quite so Evenki friendly. There's Patreon, that's number 1. So you can give a monthly contribution that starts at $1, and that will give you access for as long as you're a supporter to all the bonus shows, and there's 30 plus of those now, so hours and hours of bonus content, and I'm still producing them. There's more going up regularly. I've got several more queued just for the coming month. So that's your first option. Second option, this is a new one, I've just launched it. I've called it TrChFic Deluxe. And it's basically a different way to access all the bonus shows. You get access by making a one-off payment of $10, but that never expires, and you get access to all the bonus shows, which, like I said, I'm still making. There's more and more of them. So that's probably makes more economic sense in the longer term, if that's how you like to think. Speaking of which, if you'd rather just give a one-off contribution, there's Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal. Those don't get you anything in return. Those just get you my thanks. If it's Buy Me a Coffee, I'll be able to leave a little comment and thank you personally. So yeah, those are the 4 places where you can support the show. And there is one place where I've sort of gathered all the links for them. I've made a support page on the TrChFic homepage. So 2 quick ways to get to that. You can look in the show notes and click the support link, or you can go to the TrChFic homepage, which is TrChFic, trchfic.podbean.com. Click the wee thing at the top right that says help support TrChFic. It's got a little hammer and, well, 2 kinds of hammer crossed over in good leftist fashion. And click on that and all the support links are there. And yeah, that's all you need to know, I think. Yeah, so let's get on with the news, the TrChFic news. We've got 3 things, as per usual. Now, the first one, this is an event. It's another online event that I'm trying to spread the word about. So some of you might remember that we covered a book called The Book of Shanghai on the podcast earlier. So it was published by Comma Press down in Manchester, UK, and also involved were the Manchester Confucius Institute, and we had the editor of the book and one of their top people, Karen Wang, talking to me about the book on that episode. Well, the Manchester Confucius Institute is launching, or is going to be hosting, an online event, and that's happening on the 18th of November, 2 p.m. British Standard Time. So not your local time if you're not in the UK. Although you might be in Ireland, then it would be the same time. But yeah, I'll quickly read the about for this event. What is it like to be a writer in 21st century China, writing about Shanghai, a futuristic metropolis and one of the world's biggest cities? Join us for a literary exploration of the city of Shanghai as part of a very special event, showcasing Comma's City Anthology, The Book of Shanghai, which features 10 contemporary Chinese authors. We will be joined by 2 contributing authors, Chen Danyang and Wang Zhanhai, who will be in conversation with Comma Press CEO and publisher Ra Page about what it's like to be a young female writer in China today. I'll give a disclaimer here. Miss Chen and Ms. Wang are the young female writers in China. Ra Page is a man in England. Although he is living today, he is part of the present. So that event is, like I said, happening on the 18th. There'll be a link to it in the show notes. It's free. I don't know if Eventbrite are setting a limit to the number of attendees. I would assume not, but there you go. So yeah, check that one out. Our second news item. I think I've consistently had at least one Chinese sci-fi news item in the TrChFic news for almost forever. I guess it's a good thing because more and more news about Chinese sci-fi and translation keeps coming out. So there's always something to talk about. So Tor, who are the North American publishers of most of the Chinese sci-fi available in print, have announced a new book. It's called The Way Spring Arrives and Other Stories, a new collection of Chinese SFF in translation. It's edited by Yu Chen, who I haven't heard of before, and Regina Canyu Wang, who's one of the authors featured in Ken Liu's 2 anthologies, and she's quite involved in the Chinese sci-fi sort of scene over in Shanghai, I think, is where she is based, or at least where she kind of got her start, so to speak. So this is an interesting one. It's got a lot of authors involved and a lot of translators. And there's also 4 essayists. So there's a lot of different people involved here. I'm not going to read the whole Tor page. I will read the list of authors and translators, though, because it's a bit of a who's who. Anna Wu, these are the authors. Anna Wu, Chen Qian, Chi Hui, Chu Xidao, Count Yi, I guess that's an online name, Gu Shi, Ling Chen, Nian Yu, Shen Dacheng, Shen Yingying, Wang Nuonuo, Willow L, Xia Jia, Xiu Xinyu, Zhao Haihong. Okay, and your translators. We've got some former show guests here, actually. Kara Healy, Carmen Yiling Yan, Elizabeth Hanlon, Emily Xueni Jin. That's Emily Jin from the episode we did on Gujian. You might remember her. Et Valere, Etvo from the episode we did on Necropolis of Mortal. Gigi Chang, she was on the show too. She was talking about Legend of the Condor Heroes, the episode we did for that. Judith Huang, Judy Yi Zhou, Rebecca F. Kwang. If that name rings a bell, she's the author of what are they called? The Poppy War and that series of books. Ru Ping Chen and Yilin Wang. You might remember Yilin Wang was on the episode we did on The Woman in the Carriage, the Chuanqi. So yeah, and the essayist too. So Emily Jin is also an essayist. Jing Tzu, Rebecca F. Kwang again, and Shueting Christine Ni, who's a name that pops up a lot on Chinese literature Twitter, and she's cool. So huge number of interesting names. I believe it's all women. Yeah, pretty sure it's all women. Let me read the blurb, see if it says anything about that. Tor.com Publishing is thrilled to announce that Lindsay Hall and Ruoshi Chen have acquired world English rights to The Way Spring Arrives and Other Stories, a new anthology of Chinese fiction and fantasy written, edited, and translated by women and non-binary creators. There you go. From Regina Canyu Wang, Zhang Yiwen, and Emily Xuenijin at Storycom. Yeah, interesting. So I'll put a link to this news in the show notes. It'll all be there. My thoughts. So the fact it's all women, that is and non-binary people, that is of course interesting. The thing that's jumping out at me is that it's SFF, not SF. So it's Chinese science fiction and fantasy. The subtitle of the book is A New Anthology of Chinese Fiction and Fantasy in Translation. So if you've read the 2 Ken Liu anthologies that Tor put out, you'll have noticed that the first book there was 1 or 2 stories that you could say had some like kind of fantasy elements, but it was really presented especially in the like intro essays as being an anthology of sci-fi. That was Invisible Planets, the first one. The second one, Broken Stars, Ken Liu mentioned in his intro that he was trying to include some of the other genres that kind of go alongside sci-fi in China. So some fantasy. I mean, I guess that goes alongside sci-fi in literature in general and in English. And he also included a story that was more of a specific Chinese genre, a sort of time travel, historical fantasy sort of thing. The Snow of, I think it was Jinyang, but I might be wrong. Yeah, so it's interesting to see that the fantasy coming along with sci-fi in translation is another thing. So Tor is kind of doing that again, or they're in a way, whether it's deliberate or not, they're taking it a step further. So that's interesting to see. Okay, third piece of news, heading out of genre fiction back into sort of literary fiction, if you want to call it that. So I mentioned earlier on a previous episode that the Newman Prize had been announced, and they shortlisted the various authors. So that's it's a prize for Chinese literature, and it's sponsored by the University of Oklahoma Institute for U.S.-China Issues. Yes, I am just reading this off the page here. The Newman Prize is awarded biennially in recognition of outstanding achievement in prose or poetry that best captures the human condition and is conferred solely on the basis of literary merit. And the winner gets $10,000, a commemorative plaque, and a bronze medallion. Previous winners include... Oh no, interesting. These are... Oh, scratch that part. So yeah, basically, to cut a long story short, the winner was Yan Lianke. He won it this time. So not for any particular work, I think, but Yan Lianke was the winner. He is, I think, he's a writer who writes pretty much like dissident works that go into issues in China's present or history and present them critically, basically. So politically critical writing. And the guy, Yan, he still lives in China. He doesn't get much. It's very hard for him to publish. He's, I think, generally disliked by the literary establishment and heavily censored and so on, but he's never, or at least he's not in jail or anything like that. We have a statement here from another former show guest, Eric Abrahamson, who was one of the jurors who helped select him. So he's kind of gave a statement about why he likes Yan, or why Yan was the winner. So here we go. This is Eric Abrahamson's quote. Yan's writing does for the Chinese heartland what John Steinbeck did for the American West, or Thomas Hardy for Southwest England. He remains vitally invested in the ethical responsibility of the author. Though it has been demonstrated to him again and again that his explorations of China's historical trauma are not welcome, he seems not to take the hint and persists in laying bare what he sees as the original sins of modern Chinese society. His stubbornness and the perpetual freshness of his sorrow over historical tragedy are worthy of respect. So yeah, I've not read anything by Yan Lianke yet. I would really like to though. I think the one I'm particularly drawn to is the one, The Day the Sun Died. I think that's what it's called, just because that's the title itself, and I think the premise of the book are right up my sort of alley, my aesthetic alley. So yeah, congratulations, Yan Lianke. That's the end of the TrChFic news. It was a little bit longer this time, I think. But, you know, it was cool news. I liked going into it. By the way, if you're listening or if you are a listener and you come across some news that you think should be covered on the show in whatever the upcoming episode happens to be, don't hesitate to get in touch via social media or what have you. That would be really great. You'd save me some work. And, you know, you might catch things that I'm not seeing, which would also be great. So, yeah, don't be shy there. Anyway, enough waffling. Let's begin the interview between me and Bruce Humes about Last Quarter of the Moon. So on the show, we have Bruce Humes. Hi, Bruce. How's it going? And what have you been up to lately?
Well, recently I left Corona Paradise, which is Taiwan, where there's just about no cases at all. But my visa ran out, and they let me stay for a long time. I finally moved from there to I'm in Istanbul now, in Turkey. So I'm studying Turkish and really enjoying being in Turkey because, as long as you're wearing a mask and, taking the usual precautions, you can travel throughout the country. So I've been to Trabzon recently, to an ancient monastery, 4th century. And I'm currently translating an autobiography of a Chinese archaeologist who dedicated her career to the Mogao or the Mogao caves, which are located in Dunhuang, the very famous grottos there, where Indian civilization, Central Asian civilization, and Chinese came together over several centuries and left dozens and dozens of caves with mainly Buddhist paintings in them. So it's pretty interesting. And it's my second Silk Road related book in the last year.
Would I be right in saying that you're in general quite interested in kind of places and times when different kind of civilizations and cultures have had some like mixing or exchange or have just existed on a frontier together? Is that something that kind of gets your brain going? Am I right in thinking that?
Oh, absolutely. So, I went to China and had a career in publishing and so on in the big cities, which are, of course, dominated by the Han. And then I began to be interested in the other peoples of China. And so that naturally, over a period of 10, 15 years, it got me interested in the borderlands. And so I was, where non-Chinese, non-Han Chinese, lived for centuries and then gradually, mixed with the Han Chinese, particularly the Northeast and peoples who speak an Altaic language, and Altaic meaning possibly, well, there's three main components. It would be the Tungusic languages like Manchu, and then you have Mongolian, and the Turkic languages like Uyghur. So yeah, I'm very interested in the mixing and the way people are integrated into a society, and the way that ideas flow from one group, one ethnicity to another. Yeah.
Pardon me if this is a very ill-informed question, but since you're studying Turkish now, could that potentially help you understand other languages in the Turkic language family, including the ones which are kind of still present inside China?
Absolutely. So, I've altogether I've studied 8 languages, and so the Romance languages, for instance, Spanish and Italian are pretty close, but actually the Turkic languages, you're going all the way from say Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang all the way to Turkey. There are various nations, most of which end with STAN, the stands, that speak, where the people speak some kind of Turkic language. And particularly if you're looking at it, it's written, if it's Romanized, I think if you know any Turkic language, you can probably figure out an awful lot of what it says. But apparently, for instance, at the beginning of the 20th century, a well-educated person in Istanbul could, take in a train or whatever to somewhere in Xinjiang, like Urumqi, and gotten off the train and spoken to people, might have had to write out some things, but would have been able to communicate. So the Turkic language, in terms of sound, and I'm not a linguistic expert at all, but in terms of sound, it's very similar. As you move from one country to another, and meet with different dialects, but there's not that much change.
That's fascinating. I would like to keep talking about this, but we should probably shift our focus from the northwest to the northeast, which is the setting of our book for this episode, Last Quarter of the Moon. And it's about a herding people who live in the kind of the part of China which they live in is the far northeast, but they also exist beyond the borders too, which we'll be talking about. And that people are the Evenki. So I think for this episode, before we start talking about the book itself, the thing that we should get to grips with is the Evenki themselves. So here's my first question along those lines. You've already talked a wee bit about China's ethnic diversity, especially around its borders. And I think for some of the listeners of this show, that's going to be quite common knowledge. They might know a little bit or a lot, but we might also have some other listeners who really it's really very much like new territory for them. It's something that we'll have to kind of fill in, join the dots for them. So can you give us a quick overview of how the Evenki fit into kind of the, I don't want to use, I was about to say ethnic tapestry, that seems way too belabored, but how they fit in as an ethnic group in China's northeast?
Right. So there, of course, there's a number of officially recognized ethnicities in that area. And there's, of course, the Manchu, the Evenki, various speakers of the Tungusic languages. So, and Manchu and Evenki are both belong to that. There's the Daur, who are, I believe, a Mongolic people who speak a language close to Mongolian. And altogether, most of them probably at one point or another had their roots in what the Russians would call the Far East, Siberia, really. So the Evenki, their roots are in Siberia near Lake Baikal, which of course now today is in Russia. These people, if you were to see many of them, I think, if you're from the United States or Canada, you would think they look an awful lot like Eskimos. And I would assume they're related, but I don't know quite how. So a lot of the area of what was what is Northeast China was really the homeland of the Manchus in particular, and the Evenki were a fairly smaller group of people. There's only about 60,000 of them now, and they're split pretty evenly between Russia and China, mainly either Heilongjiang, the province of Heilongjiang, and to a certain extent Inner Mongolia.
So the book covers this, or at least it presents a version of how the Evenki, or at least the Evenki family that we follow, their ancestors were kind of driven out of an expanding Russia into what became China's northeast. And it's impossible, I guess, like when I arrived in China, I had a lot to learn, and it's impossible to learn it all very quickly. So quite regularly I'd learn something new about the country or the region that it's in, and my mind would be blown yet again. And I remember one thing that kind of was yet another miniature mind explosion that reframed how I understood the country was when I was talking to a Russian friend I had who was from Vladivostok, and she showed me where Vladivostok was on the map, and then said, I forget if it was she told me or if I looked it up myself, but Vladivostok, that was once territory, Chinese territory, and it became Russian, I guess, at some point in history. And when that led me down a whole kind of thought of, what was this region before it was Russian, or perhaps before it was Chinese? How many times has it changed hands? It's not something I have a full understanding of, but it was interesting to come back to it in the context of this book, which isn't, it doesn't follow Han Chinese people, doesn't follow Russians, it's following another group. I don't think that leads into any kind of question, really. Is there anything else we should say about the Evenki of China in particular before we... no, this is exactly my next question. Sorry. Yeah, the question about how exactly the Evenki ended up split between Russia and China.
Right.
Can you illuminate the listeners any better than I've just done?
A bit. I'm not an expert on the history of the area, but it is covered to a certain extent in the book indirectly, and I read a bit about it. So really, the important date would be to remember the treaty, or to mention the Treaty of Nerchinsk, which is Nerchinsk, which was negotiated between the Russians and the Manchu. And so I think actually if Vladivostok, if China really has any claim to that part of Russia, it would be because of the Manchu, not because of the Han Chinese.
Right.
The Manchu probably claim that as part of their home territory. So the Cossacks did chase the Evenki and other peoples who ended up in China southward, and this treaty was negotiated, and basically what it did was set the border, which is still valid today, at the Amur River, which is what the Russians and Europeans call the Heilongjiang River, which means Black Dragon River. So essentially, north of the Amur became Russia, and this was accepted by the Manchu. And then the southern part eventually became Manchuria, and then Heilongjiang. So crucially for the Evenki, that meant that their spiritual home and probably their actual home several thousand years ago, Lake Baikal, was in Russia, was left in Russian hands. And so eventually what happened was that the Evenki became split into two major groups, and one of them stayed in Russia and the other in Heilongjiang and Inner Mongolia. And the ones who stayed in Russia apparently became focused mainly on herding horses, while those who ended up in China, of course, became the reindeer herders that we read about in Last Quarter of the Moon.
And do we know before that split, were they one or the other, or do we know anything about that?
I don't know. No, I don't know much about how that split occurred otherwise. But of course, the river is a major separator, and then later on, politically, it became once China and Russia and the Soviet Union had their breakup, if you like, then it became impossible for a few decades for people to cross over normally. So one would assume they speak somewhat differently and have somewhat different customs. But there is and I don't remember right now what the name is in Russian, but there is a region just north of the Amur, which is, I think it's called an oblast, Oblast.
Yeah, that sounds
which
right.
is devoted, it's essentially an autonomous region run by, I think they're called Evenks, not Evenki. Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, there's probably a whole other podcast someone else could do about the way that borders have evolved over the decades and the centuries, but that's not us. There is something I want to slip in though, that I think also would be worth getting to grips with, not because it directly concerns the book, but it might be a useful kind of reference point later, and that's the Chinese term minzu. So the rough translation would be something like an ethnicity. I think it's often translated as nationality, but and I believe that they copied it. The Chinese state copied this from Soviet Russia, but they have a set number of official minzu, like official ethnic groups. I think there's 55 or 56 of them, and I really I should have reminded myself of this before starting the interview, but I want to ask you whether or not the Evenki are one of the official minzu, because I know there are disputed ethnic groups in China who who are not.
Well, the answer is yes, they are. So there's 55 non-Han groups, and then the Han are the 56th.
Right.
So I think in Northeast China, it's not that big of an issue, but when you get down to at Yunnan, that area in Guangxi, there are real discrepancies between how many, which group you're said to belong to and which group you actually feel you belong to. And I know there's a very interesting statistic, and that is that something like 1952, I think the first census was done by the PRC, first official one, and over 400 different minzu were reported to exist in the province of Yunnan alone.
Oh my God.
So you can imagine, basically what was going on was that the Chinese, this is the first time it was ever done, and they were pretty much aping the Soviets at that time. And I think they looked at that list and thought, oh dear,
Right.
that's too many to deal with. And so, you got shoveled into one or the other, depending perhaps on where you were living at a particular time, even though the group whose name went on your ID card, you don't speak their language and you don't relate to those people as your people. Yeah. Actually, the same thing happened in Taiwan. And in the last 10 or 15 years in Taiwan, I think there's about a dozen. The Taiwanese government has said, okay, we recognize that. And so, which groups should we add to that list, and which ones do you want to belong to? But as I understand it, that has not been happening in China. There's 55 non-Han ethnicities, and that's where it's going to stay.
Right. I've just put in something into Google because you mentioned before that in Russia there's a little autonomous oblast, little district, which is kind of dedicated in a way to the events of Russia. And I've just reminded myself, by the magic of Google, China has a rough equivalent. It's in Inner Mongolia, and it's the Evenki Autonomous Banner. I guess banner, that's a reference to the Manchu banners of the Qing dynasty. But this one's in Inner Mongolia, and the action of our book, Last Quarter of the Moon, it's nowhere near there. But
right. Yeah. The Evenki, they are somewhat spread out in northeast China, but my understanding is that most of them traditionally lived in what are called the Greater Khingan Mountains. That's Khingan, which is Da Xing'an in Chinese. And those mountains themselves, I think, are partly in Heilongjiang and partly in Inner Mongolia.
Right.
But nowadays, at the near the end of the novel, they're basically forced out of their home in the mountains, and the particular clan that is covered in the book really actually ended up being moving themselves, if you like, settling, at least for a while, in the city of Genhe, as Genhe of Inner Mongolia.
Right. Okay. Well, pardon me, I stand corrected. This actually leads really nicely on to my next question. So we've established that there Evenki are, at least the Evenki of China, are a reindeer herding people, and they're also a nomadic people. So they, at least as I've learned in Last Quarter of the Moon, they go from place to place, never degrading the environment too much that it's permanently diminished. So at least in the book, the reindeer eat a particular kind of moss, and the Evenki always move on before the moss is depleted. But yeah, by the end of the novel, like you're saying, there a significant number of them have switched to like a settled life, like the ones me and you. Well, maybe not yourself being on the road right now, but yeah, the lives that most of us live in one place with a roof and walls around us, roof over our head, and so on. Is there much we can say about the nomadic lifestyle of the Evenki, or?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. There's some very interesting things about it. So one of the things is that people probably assume that they eat their reindeer, but they don't. The reindeer for them are pretty sacred. And so what they do with their reindeer is to let them go off, mainly during the night. That's when they go foraging for the kind of fungus they like to eat and other things. And they'll come back, particularly because their young ones are not allowed to go out at the same time. So they use their reindeer for a number of things. One of them is for their milk. So they make something like yogurt from it. And they use the reindeer to transport their houses, which really are what an American would call a teepee. I don't know if that is the term in Canada, but I remember translating an early part of the book, and it was pretty difficult to understand until I took a picture. Excuse me, I went on Google and I saw what these they're called shiranju look like, and it's really just a teepee. Yeah. So their nomadic lifestyle is a little different than the say the Mongols because they're the Mongolians. Because Mongolians live in a yurt, and a yurt is a lot bigger.
Right.
So I can't really imagine more than 3 or 4 people in one of these teepees. And they love their reindeer very much, have very personal relations with them. And they're semi-nomadic. So moving every few months was the impression I got reading the book.
Right.
And it's very important to them to be able to move because later on, when they did try and live in Gunhe, near the city, in so-called fixed settlements, the reindeer started dying off, and they were feeding them kind of feed and of course hay and so on. And the reindeer were just miserable because they want to be free. And so that's part of their lifestyle, not so much that they're, maybe always thinking we want to be sure that we don't decimate an area, but the reindeer do like to move and they like to have fresh food. So I think the another point is that they are speakers of a Tungusic language, which I said is related to, is not far from Manchu. And that means that they were living in mountains where other people spoke Russian, Mongolian, Manchu, and a little Chinese. So whether, geographically or linguistically and ethnically, a very distinct people, really pretty much unrelated to the Han.
Right. Yeah, that's a good kind of lead in as we kind of are starting to move from talking about the Evenki in general to the book, the characters of Last Quarter of the Moon.
Let me bring in here. I really missed 2 very important points.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
Okay, so, or even 3. So they are they're reindeer herders, but they're also hunters and gatherers.
Mm-mm.
That's very important. So very good hunters. And there are a number of scenes in the book where they're out, imitating deer calls and so on. They love to eat moose and deer. And when they return, when the hunters return with a kill, everybody in the camp gets a decent portion. So whether or not you're a woman or a male who's too old now to go hunting or whatever, this is a highly collective society. So in the book, you're really dealing with one clan, and that clan is the Aulugaya, Aogul. Let's see, I'll come back to that in a minute.
Yeah.
This one clan, and they look after one another. Even when they get older. So the final point that I didn't bring up, which would be a travesty not to mention, is that they're animists and
yes.
they're shamanists. So that's very important.
Yeah, that was kind of where I was going with this next question to some extent. So I read Wolf Totem not so long before reading this one, and you mentioned there's different, although there's a nomadic Mongol way of life and there's a nomadic Evenki way of life, there are like similarities and differences, like you mentioned. And I probably, at least this once, it'd be worth mentioning some similarities and differences between Last Quarter of the Moon and Wolf Totem. So one big similarity is they're both works written by Han authors, looking at pretty much other non-Han Minzu, so to speak, other ethnicities within China. But a thing that you really, Wolf Totem does not let you ignore is that it has like a big ecological argument. It's a kind of a lament about how I guess economic changes, really, or whatever you want to call them, but changes at the human political economic level brought ruination to the ecosystems that the ethnic Mongols were living in Inner Mongolia. And they're, like you mentioned, the Evenki people, they're animists. They have very strong feelings about their reindeer. They live very closely with nature. It's where their spirituality is focused on. And I think especially towards the end, there is some focus on like the damage done to the environment and social change and so on. But when you're thinking about Last Quarter of the Moon, do you think of it as like an ecological novel, or a novel with some kind of an eco message, or is that not the way you think about the book?
Oh, I think that's definitely there. Basically there were three waves of outsiders who encroached on the Evenki. And first of all, it was the Russians who pushed them down southward, mainly because they wanted their hunting territory. Mink in particular, very very valuable to people that live in a cold climate, and the Russians wanted that mink. And then, of course, the Japanese. But the first problems that they had with the territory where they lived was when the Han Chinese came after 1949, because they wanted access to the forests, these huge forests that had never been cut down. And so as they came in, they built roads, and then these huge logging trucks, coming in and out, and many lumberjacks, knocking down the trees. And so what that meant immediately to the Evenki was that there were a lot less places where they could take their reindeer who were sensitive to the noise and who needed constantly to be eating, fresh types of fungus and so on, that grow only where there's a certain space between trees that allows the sunlight in, but not too much. So within 5, 10, 15 years of the logging, their environment was being destroyed, the environment they needed for their reindeer. And then as you moved into the 60s and 70s, the Chinese were concerned that there was too much hunting going on. Of course, only some of it was being done by the Evenki. And so eventually, the Evenki were banned from hunting. So they went, from being hunters and gatherers and herders to really being only herders. And then, of course, the land was, they were restricted where they could go. And then their animals could not find enough fresh fungus to survive. So definitely. And I think that's, it is an ecological tale. And it's very well told in that sense, by Zijian, who at one point, I think, the narrator is berated by a party official who has come to talk to them and try to get them to move down out of the mountains. This would be late 80s, early 90s, and to so-called fixed residences. And she says, look, we, the Evenki, we're nothing more than our footprint is equivalent to that of a Qingting. It's not a firefly. What is it? There's very elegant flies that I can't think of the word right now. Skimming a stream. I mean,
Yeah.
we don't have a footprint. And you come here and you knock down all the trees and you use, rifles to decimate the local animals. How can you blame us? So it's a very moving scene, and
Yeah.
there's no doubt about it. It is a novel with a message about the ecology, but a very different one than, say, Wolf Totem, which is about the Mongolians on the open plain, and how much of the grass and what damage their sheep and horses and so on might be doing to that environment. But the Evenki, comparatively speaking, a very light touch, a very small footprint.
Yeah, this kind of leads me into something I was meaning to ask you. So I'm trying to think of like another contrast between Wolf Totem and Last Quarter of the Moon, and one that springs to mind just now is that Wolf Totem is, I don't know, for lack of a better term, it's an extremely male book, as well as the eco message. There's a huge amount of battle imagery and war tactics, strategy, language to describe things which didn't necessarily have to be described that way. Like the way nature and particularly wolves operate is described as if it's like a in language that you'd associate with battle tactics and things like that. And all the characters are male, bar one woman who, again, for lack of a better term, she kind of just behaves like one of the lads. So yeah, so there's that. And then we have Last Quarter of the Moon, where our narrator is a woman. It's about her life story, and the cast, it's a familial group. So it's, represented accurately. Like in any family, there are men, there are women, there are old men, old women, there are boys, there are girls. And yeah, the thing is written by a female author, narrated by a woman. And the point this is getting me to is, when I tried looking for some like academic secondary reading about the book, and I went hunting behind the academic paywall, I did find quite a lot of stuff, but it looked like it was written or possibly auto-translated, or just written in quite janky English from Chinese universities. So I was kind of looking through that to find the one that had a very clearly written title, at least in English. And I got one from an academic called Lan Lan Du, or Du Lan Lan, a woman working in Shanghai Jiaotong University. And it was looking at the book, and another one about Native Americans from the was the term ecofeminist perspective. And the essay starts off by explaining what the basic kind of starting point of ecofeminism is. And the starting point is that ecofeminists argue that the domination of women by the patriarchy and the domination of the environment by like economic forces, let's say, are structurally linked. That's the starting assumption. And then the argument goes from there, looking at the ways that women are treated or represented in the novels, and the way the environment is. I'm not sure how much we can get from reading Last Quarter of the Moon that way, but I do think it was a good starting point to get me thinking about how in some way it's a book about women, or being a woman in that kind of change, in that changing period in that region of the world. But do you think there's much to go on there, the linking women's life and their treatment and the treatment of the environment in this book?
I never gave that any thought. I'm not sure that I could add anything to that kind of conversation. I do agree that the narrator is a woman, the writer is a woman, the narrator is a woman, and possibly, well, certainly, her insights into the psychology of the narrator, is quite moving and quite profound. But no, I wouldn't know what to say to that.
Yeah,
No.
I kind of felt the same reading the essay. I felt that I should have some kind of smart point here. I don't really, but now that I think of it, actually, I recall reading the book. A thing that struck me as kind of a surprise was the role of the shaman. So the shaman of the tribe at the start of the book, it's a man. but the torch eventually passes to at least one of the younger women. I don't know if more than one woman holds the role of shaman.
One.
Yeah,
One.
maybe, yeah. From my assumption, my in quote marks patriarchal assumption was only men could be shamans, but in Evenki society, that's not the case. Because I remember when I was doing some reading around, looking at a site that has some really nice, really interesting pictures of Evenki you sent me. I'm pretty sure there was a female shaman. I think one of the last shamans of the Evenki, I think,
Right.
It's documented as a woman. Is there much we can say about that?
Right. Well, I think, like in most traditional societies, certainly like West Africa and say the Mongolians. I translated part of a novel by a Mongolian who grew up in Inner Mongolia, a Chinese citizen. His name is Guo Xuebo, Guoxuebo. And he wrote a novel in Chinese, and I've translated a small part of an extract. And in it, it's obvious that traditionally among the Mongolians, it's not easy for a woman to become a shaman because, at least in the novel, there is a woman who works as a midwife, but actually acquires the role of a shaman, even though her mentor or would-be mentor refuses to teach her certain things because she's a woman. So I would assume that there's a prejudice there. But in Last Quarter of the Moon, no. You're chosen by fate, not by your gender. And so the first one is indeed a male, and he's rather, in his own way, somewhat self-destructive. And then the woman who takes over as the shaman for this clan is quite tragic because she's very sensitive to things that cannot be seen, where someone is at a certain time, her children. She somehow knows that they're in trouble. But the very sad thing about it is that each time that she saves someone using her she goes into what they call a trance dance, and perhaps exorcises a demon or helps him get well. The price of that is that one of her own children dies. So it's really quite tragic, and you feel it again. It's female author, female narrator, and it's very painful. So it was possible among the Evenki for a female to become a shaman, but I'm not sure that it was quite as in traditional times. I'm not sure it happened quite that much.
Right. Good answer. And this kind of makes me want to jump ahead slightly to a question I wrote about shamanic magic in Last Quarter of the Moon. So we've already established it's very important for their belief in the way they understand the world and relate to it and how they go about their way of life. It's all sort of tied together in their animism, and their shaman is in a way like as well as being someone who can kind of call on powers to help them out when they need it. It's the shaman is kind of like their mediator with the unseen parts of the natural world. What I'm getting to here is that across the course of the novel, we see multiple instances where the shamans seem to be doing real magic, or to put it another way, by their own kind of arts particular to them, they manage to bring about changes in the real world, which are aimed at benefiting the tribe. Things like we're just describing, like curing a sickness and so on. And then, like conversely, for the shamaness, female shaman, not only is she able to affect the world positively, but her acts or spells or whatever you want to call them also have adverse costs, which again appear to be real. Magic seems to be real to some extent in the book. And we also see some instances where animals seem to possess some kind of magic, or things involving animals that would seem to defy science or the laws of nature. or something happen. So my question is just, what do you make of all these? Why do you think Zijian included what appears to be magic in the book?
Well, I think there's several levels that one could talk about. One of them is that she grew up in northeast China, in a town called Mohe, which actually is on the Argonne, which is a tributary of the Amur. And actually, Mohe is supposed to be the northernmost outpost in all of China. So very cold.
Right.
And she, over the years, has written a few dozen short stories and several novels. But the short stories in particular, I haven't read all of them, I read a few of them, do tend to have a motif of folk legends, if you like, which involve spirits and shamans, this sort of thing. And that is actually present in the culture of the non-Han people of Northeast China. So for her to write about it is quite normal. In terms of literary trends, I mean, it's obvious that she's read some of the Latin American, possibly other place authors who, become well known because of their, quote, magical realism. Yeah. And that's really been, there was a while there in China where not everybody, but writers of her generation became enthralled with that sort of thing, and readers appreciate it. So you could say it's merely a tool to gain interest in their writing. But for me, on a highly personal level, as a person and a reader, and I once had a bit of an argument with Zijian because I told her, I said, I didn't just translate your novel. I said, I read it. I read it first before I translated it, and it hit me in the gut. And there are certain things that really struck me, and this use of magic and the animist aura in the book, and mountains and trees and animals having their own spirit, their own soul. It feels quite genuine to me, and one of the reasons is that I grew up in the north. People often ask me where I come from, and of course, in China, so if you say Beipangren, from the north, then they think, oh, you mean Manchuria? I said, no, I wasn't born in Manchuria. I was raised outside of Chicago, but in some ways, quite similar. It snows a good 4 months of the year around Chicago, Wisconsin, that area. It's really almost in terms of weather, it's more like Canada than the United States. And I had a deep emotional attachment to nature, to the long snowy winters, the forests, which I spent several months of my preteen years in camping out at summer camps for 2 or 3 months, during which time I didn't see my parents. And we were taught how to dance and how to make a bow and arrow and so on by Native Americans. And I, at that time, felt deeply attached to particularly freshwater lakes and pine tree forests and strange rocks and mountains. And then later on, when I lived in Hong Kong, I went to Japan several times to study Japanese, and I always felt that the Buddhist temples in Japan were just totally tasteless. And then one time I went to a Shinto temple, and I was just blown away. I thought, well, I belong here. Which, of course, the Japanese would think is very funny because they think of it as a national religion.
Yes.
But it's animist, and I really related to it. So, to get back to your question, I feel that the way the book was written, that most of those references and those scenes are very well done, and therefore, given my past and the fact that I'm not a Christian. I'm not Jewish. I'm not Muslim. I don't belong to the Abrahamic religions. The closest thing in my life to something like religion is something along the lines of a difficult to describe animism. Therefore, I thought she did a very good job of bringing those things, animate and inanimate, alive, and I found it quite believable. But nonetheless, I would think, as I mentioned in a few of my interviews about the book that appeared in China, the novel is not perfect. And I felt one of the weaker parts was she's very good with the shamans and their rites and so on, but particularly the things they sing during their trance dances and so on. Maybe because it was all in Hanwen, it was all in Chinese, and I just can't imagine the Evenki speaking Chinese, especially when they're communicating with the spirits. So that was a disappointment to me.
Right.
So, my answer would be I think she's a professional writer. She uses those things to make her story more interesting, but it is very well interwoven into the plot, and to me, quite believable that these people would have these kind of feelings and do these kind of things.
Yeah, what you were saying about not having a religion but feeling something like that in a connection to the earth, that's I found that really. I don't normally say something this sincere and cheesy to my guests on the show, but I found that really moving. I like my own something I've never talked about on the show, because why would I? But first 12 years of my life, I went to church. The reason for that was my mum thought I wanted to go, and I thought my mum wanted to go. So it was a sort of a vacuous circle of obligations.
Yeah.
I was there. And yeah, it didn't really do much for me except made me feel morally superior and guilty all the time. So wasn't great. Kind of an amazingly human combo of feeling good and feeling bad at the same time, and feeling good for bad reasons. That's what I associate with Christianity. So around the time of start of high school, so in Scotland and the UK, high school starts about 12. There's no middle school. So about 12 years old, I was like, no, you know what? I'm an agnostic. I'm not so sure about this. And then age 14, becoming a bit more of a firebrand, it's like, no, I'm an atheist, because I have strong opinions and I'm not stuck in the middle. And then hitting 17, starting to think about what is my place in the universe? Do I really, do I really want to believe anything? I'm going to work out. At that age, I was very into exactly defined things. I guess that's not an unusual impulse for a teenager or a very young adult. So I was like, okay, I'm going to work out exactly what my political beliefs are, and I'm going to slap a label on them. And I suppose because there is a field for that in my Facebook profile, I should do the same for my religious beliefs too, or at least my spiritual beliefs. And the one I settled on after having learned a little bit of basics of Western philosophy, the one I liked was pantheism, which is, it doesn't really have many requirements of the believer, but the fundamental thing is, if you're a pantheist, you believe God is not a thinking being, or not a being. You believe God and the universe are the same thing. So they're synonyms. And it can kind of imply some kind of reverence of nature. And you believe that nothing exists outside the universe, that reality is all there is, even if your senses can't pick up all of it, and you're part of it, you're not separate from it either. And nowadays, as an adult who's realized labels are very unhelpful in the same way Christianity's unhelpful, it's just another way to think that you're great and have the right idea. Now, as far as what I think the universe and the right way to relate to it is, I'm not so certain. But I think what you were saying about finding something, not in romanticizing the beliefs of the various indigenous peoples of the world who couldn't really mesh with the coming of modernity. The answer is obviously not to romanticize them, but if you got something out of that vision or that way of connecting with nature, I think there's a lot to it. And I think it might, I'm really waffling now, so thank you for being patient. But yeah, I think there is something to reality that those people experience that modernity wipes away for the modern individual. Just yesterday, I was talking to my girlfriend about cats, and I told her the story of a
Sorry about what?
cats. Cats.
Yes. Yes.
Don't worry, this is going somewhere. And I was telling her about a cat that used to live on my granny's street, and it was like a cat of the street. So it had official owners, but it basically lived at every house. It would go and spend time with everybody. And then one day, it just the family moved away. The cat went all the way out into the countryside north of Dundee, and it took the journey in the car, so there's no way it could know the way back. But then give it like a week, and the cat shows up again on the street. And the way I think about that is, of course, there is some kind of scientific explanation, but that it's something that's so deep in nature. I feel that there are things in the ways that animals have their relationship with the world around them that we've lost, that perhaps some ways of life that still exist on the planet have just recently lost or still have. And yeah, I don't know. That doesn't really equate to a religious belief, but I really believe it's important to have a good relationship with the universe. And in some ways, that might be the one kind of magic that can exist on the earth. So yeah, I don't know if
Well,
reading
I
the
think
book did that for
anybody
me,
that
but yeah.
feels ties to nature, seeing climate change, it is frightening, and it makes one feel, to a certain extent, that we're paying a price for abusing the world. And in one of the better parts of the novel, actually, well, not the novel itself, but the writing that she did about it, is that Zijian wrote an afterword, and she laments the fact that yes, okay, perhaps God did expel us from the Garden of Eden, but not in order to rape Mother Nature. And it's pretty clear now that we've been abusing in a horrible, horrible way our environment, and it's coming back to haunt us. It's quite frightening. And if you
Yeah.
really love it the way certain indigenous people do, as typically, like the Aborigines of Australia, the Native Americans, Native Canadians, it must be very, very saddening. But even those of us who didn't grow up in that kind of tradition were beginning to get the message.
Yeah, there's a song that I've discovered just this year. It's by a band called the Handsome Family, and it basically it's about what I was trying really ineptly with far too many words to get across, the feeling of like disconnection from losing a connection with nature that you maybe didn't even realize you have, and that the animals still have. The lyrics go something like this: "They used to think the swallows were living underwater all through the winter when they were missing from the trees. They used to think the geese budded from the branches each gentle sunny spring when they came back again. But the swallows and the geese, they have always heard the ringing of the bells that echo through the earth," and then to skip to the last four lines. "But the airplanes overhead hang heavy in the air. All the shiny cars, they circle in despair. Where am I, they cry. Where are you? Where am I? But they will never hear the bells that ring tonight." And I feel like a bit of an idiot for quoting lyrics from some random song, but when I think about the place that the narrator is in, it kind of is what do you call it? Like a book ending. There's a more technical term that I've forgotten, but we start off with the narrator as an old lady at the end of her life, and she's kind of, the way I felt about it is that she's kind of looking back on the ruins of her life and her tribe. And then so after that opening, we go back to her start, her girlhood, and then by the end of the novel, we're right there back at the end. And it feels like, I guess maybe she's not the one who's circling in despair saying, "Where am I? Where am I?" But the younger people of the tribe they've had to deal with the modern world and the modern economy. One of them becomes an artist and joins China's art scene, but there's a huge drift into alcoholism, depression, aimlessness. And I know alcoholism is a pretty big issue in the, what are they called? The reservations of North America.
Right.
I mean, maybe this is making a stupid generalization, but I feel like the despair those rapidly modernized indigenous people feel could be a little bit like the source of angst we have as people cut off from the nature that we spring from. And who knows, when climate change really starts to bite and the world starts to, the nature that we've disregarded comes back to haunt us. That feeling of like, what the hell happened? Where am I? What's going on? I feel like that might be the age to come, an age of even greater, just like, where am I? What's happening?
Disaffection, yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that your listeners might want to do, besides reading a novel, if they want to get a better understanding of the Evenki and of some things you're just talking about, their loss of sense of who they are and where they fit in the world, has been captured very well, not just by this novel, but in documentaries by someone named Gu Tao.
Mm.
And Gu Tao is Gu, and his own name is Tao. He's, I believe, either half or full Manchu, and he's a documentary cineast. And his father was very interested in the Evenki and actually lived with and hunted with the Evenki for a few months in the 80s and wrote a book about it, which I read. So Gu Tao has gone on to use his camera and do documentaries of actually the clan upon which this book is pretty much based, because Zijian did for a week, maybe 10 days, I think, live with or nearby the Evenki clan, some of whose characters are based on them. And he has become friends with them, and over the years has shot several documentaries about them. And they're pretty shocking because at least one of them really just, you follow a man in his late 30s, early 40s around, and he's back living in the mountains and herding reindeers and so on, but only intermittently. Why? Because he's getting drunk all the time, and you see him in the documentary, stumbling around. He's a bit of a poet, and he sings these songs, and he's very melancholic, but it's really painful. And that brings up the question of TrChFic and Gu Tao and a number of people who have written about in fictionalized form or in documentary form about this post 1990s. Now they live in fixed residence Evenkis. What happens to them? And it's really tough. And in one of the documentaries he does, a young boy who has left the mountains and is being schooled in probably Gunhe, some city in Inner Mongolia, learning Chinese, comes home and he's about 10, and really has trouble relating to mom. And mom is a heavy drinker. And she doesn't want to live in one of those fixed residences, so she's still out there, not necessarily in a teepee anymore, but in a tent, living that kind of life. And her son really has trouble relating to her, and of course now he doesn't know how to herd reindeer, and probably will soon speak Chinese better than Evenki. Quite sad. So your listeners might want to go and watch them. He's done other stuff, and he's with the Evenki, some which is quite beautiful. And I think he's done a documentary which focuses on a shaman doing his trance dance and so on. Very interesting.
Yeah, thank you for the recommendation. Were the pictures that you linked me to check out, were they Gu Tao's pictures?
And that website was set up by Gutao. Really, I mean, your listeners, if they, want to at any point, whether they've started the book or they're thinking about it or they've already read it, they should go to. It's called Northern Hunting Culture. You can find it on Google pretty easily, and it's got hundreds of pictures of the reindeer being herded, lying around, and all the handicrafts and so on that the Evenkis do using birch bark and so on. Great
Fantastic.
stuff.
I'll be sure to put a link to that in the show notes. Well, we really got into that. That's excellent. So I've got a few more questions about the book. I'll just go through them in the order they're on the paper. We've talked a bit about her already, about Zijian, the author, and you've mentioned where she's from, Mohe. I guess we should say that she herself, she's Han Chinese. Is that right?
That's right.
Yes. So she's a Han author writing about the Evenki. You mentioned before you weren't totally happy with the fact that she had all the Evenki speaking in Chinese, like Han Chinese the whole time. But do you think on the whole she did a good job writing from like outside her experience and outside her Minzu?
Well, I think that's the kind of the core question. So let me introduce a bit more about her. So she is Han, and she's monolingual. Okay, so that means she doesn't know English, she doesn't know Japanese, she doesn't know any of the languages up there. She's just Chinese. She grew up in Mohe, which has a small population of a group of an ethnicity which is very closely related to the Evenki, and they're called in English generally called the Oroquen, which is Oroquen. In Chinese is Tun.
Right.
So even though when she was young, she didn't mention that she'd ever known any Evenki, but she used to go into the mountains and collecting firewood and so on, and with her father. And she saw the Oroquen, and she wrote about it in this afterword that I talked about. And she thought that they were sort of alien to the mountains. And later on, when she grew up, she realized how absurd that was. That it was all of the lumberjacks that were going into the mountains who were the aliens, but whatever.
Right.
So another thing you need to understand about her: she is the head of the Heilongjiang branch of the state-run China Writers Association.
Right.
So this
Interesting.
person who's very much part of the bureaucracy, whatever. But I would say, and so I think there's been some criticism of her among probably the Evenki and people that are activists for the non-Han peoples and minorities in China. But I think she did a good job in the book. It's historically, it's very accurate. She's written very clearly about the first wave of the Russians and how that happened, and in particular, we can talk about this in a minute. How the Japanese who got to Manchuria in the 30s and the 40s, how they used and manipulated the Evenki, which she did in a way that seems pretty accurate. So she, as I said, she's a popular writer, published a lot of short stories, a few novels, and Last Quarter of the Moon, for instance, has been translated into French, Dutch, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Spanish, and most lately Swedish by Anna Chun. And her short stories, a few books have actually been translated into French. She's quite popular in French. So I guess the questions surrounding her are, there are a few. One of them is that as a Han who doesn't speak the language and who, by her own admission, she did an awful lot of research, and obviously very good research, because all the things that I read about and so on, they showed up in the novel and they seem to be correct and so on. But, she doesn't really know these people, has never lived among them, doesn't speak their language. So one of the first questions you have to ask is, what language was it written in? Well, obviously it's written in Chinese, but what kind of Chinese? And this is where it gets interesting. We all have to imagine, if you don't know a language and you're not a linguistics professor, you have to sort of imagine, what that language is like.
Right.
And I think, like, there's another author whose name is Ran Ping, who grew up in Inner Mongolia. He's Han, doesn't know Mongolian, and he wrote quite a number of things about Genghis Khan, and wrote some of the movie scripts for some of the best known films about the Mongolian Empire during the Yuan Chao, during the Yuan dynasty. So here you have two people who, grew up in the area, didn't have all that much contact, don't know the language, and yet they've chosen to write about this people. So they're on the outside looking inside.
Mm.
So then the question would be, in the West today, with so much being talked about, so much relating to so-called cultural appropriation, was she guilty of any of that? Was she able to sidestep it or whatever? And I would say today, in Australia, in Canada, in America, I can't speak for the rest of the world, I think her book might never have been published if she had written first person narrator, as she has, as an Australian Aborigine, or as a Native American, or an Eskimo in Canada, simply because she's from the dominant mainstream part of society, and increasingly Indigenous people are saying, no, that's not your business. We'll do that. So I respect her for going ahead and doing it. I think she did a good job of getting into this woman's mind. But getting back to the language thing, I think her imagination of the Tungusic language, the Evenki language, might be pretty far away from what it's all about, because I've been learning Turkish, and Tungusic is an Altaic language. TrChFic is an Altaic language. And the thing about Altaic languages is that they belong to a group of what are called agglutinative languages. So basically, you have all this is glue, really, that allows them to add on suffixes, 3, 4, 5 suffixes, so that words get quite long. So in English, you say, in the White House. But of course, in an agglutinative language with suffixes, you would say house in. And then if it's my brother's house, it would be perhaps something like house in my brother's, but it wouldn't be my brother's house or inside my brother's house. So
right.
It gets quite long. It's a bit like German. The words can be long, and the verb comes at the end. So
oh my God.
You can have one of those Thomas Mann sort of structures where you have a page, you have to turn the page to get to the verb, to the verbs, And in that sense, I felt that her imagination fell a little short, because the way she wrote it in Chinese is fairly short sentences, fairly blunt. And one of the things she did, which is a very interesting idea, and which I think was probably correct, was she worked hard to avoid what are called with these 4 character idioms that the Chinese have.
Right, the Chongyu.
It just makes Chinese so special, and we all love it. It's a bitch to translate, but she really avoided them. You could see that. So at times the language seemed a bit flat,
Yep.
And so in that sense, I really wonder, how accurate it was, but or how representative it was. overall, her psychological portrayal of the woman, of the narrator, I thought was most of the time, spot on, believable, and very readable.
Mm.
So that's Zijian. She's a member of the Communist Party, and obviously is pretty critical of what has been done to the Evenki and the other ethnicities in northeast China. But there's very little. She's true to history there, but and she does. There are a few scenes where she's making fun of people, including when the party secretary is up in the mountains trying to talk them into coming down. Actually, trying to talk the old lady, the narrator, into coming down because most everybody else already has.
Mm.
And you can see that this guy just doesn't get it. He doesn't understand. She doesn't want to live like that. She says, look, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I look up and out of my sharanju, my teepee, I can see the moon. It's open. She said, I've been down to these fixed settlements and you put people in boxes and I don't want to live like that. So making fun of the cadres and so on. But to be more accurate historically, I don't know exactly what happened to the Evenki, but I do know I've read some very good anthropological work and by European anthropologists, one of whom got to know the last. Maybe no, he's not. I don't think he was Evenki, but similar. The last shaman up in one of these Russian communities of a similar people, and in the 50s, the Russians arrived, the Soviets arrived, and they said several things. Number one, this shamanism, this is superstition. Okay. We Marxists, we don't believe in that rubbish. So I want you to, and actually, this man talks about it. He says he was forced to bring out his paraphernalia, his spirit drum, and these marvelous things they get dressed up in when they do their trance dances, and throw it into the fire and swear up and down that he would never again try to serve as his community's medium with the gods, with the spirits, the spirit world. And of course, the Russians were very, under Stalin, were very tough about that. And nothing of that kind appears in Last Quarter of the Moon. What happens in Last Quarter of the Moon is the second and the last shamaness has, she's lost several children and so on. And I think one of her children, certainly one of the children in the clan, starts doing all sorts of strange things. And he, goes out in the forest for hours, and he, I think, runs over coals, and his feet don't burn. And they're thinking, oh boy, we've got a shaman in the future on our hands. And they dissuade him and tell him that he is not permitted to take up this profession. So, in that sense, it's possible that the cadres from the CCP also arrived among the Evenki and didn't just try and get them to move down to a fixed settlement. Perhaps, I don't know, they were forced to give up their shamanistic practices and rites. Certainly, they were in Russia, and at that time, so much of what happened in the 40s and the 50s, in terms of the policies that were practiced in governing the ethnicities, it was just China at that point was just imitating the Soviets. So did she avoid that sort of thing, that sort of conflict, because she's a member of the Communist Party? I don't know.
When you mentioned the China Writers Association, I I was thinking I have mentioned that on the show before, and it's an interesting thing that they have over there. And one thing it does, well, it ensures that these kind of privileges, it creates a privileged literary position which is attached to the government. So back when people like Wang Shuo, people who could be somewhat dissident or badly behaved writers were writing, they could be published, but they would be kept out of the inner circle of the writers' associations. But at the same time, a lot of really great writers inside China who are able to write critically about periods in Chinese history are quite high up in these associations. Like there's Jia Pinghua, who's previously been banned and now he's been rehabilitated or what have you, and he's not continued outside the establishment. He's inside the establishment in the writers'
Well, yes,
association.
I wouldn't put it that way.
Right.
I mean, I don't know about jumping one, but
Mm.
the point is that in the 50s, it was just like it was based on the Soviet model. And
Right.
so, your work unit, if you were a writer, it was the China Writers Association, right?
Right.
And so they were paying your salary, and if you weren't good or whatever, you couldn't get published. You still got paid, but
Mm.
they wouldn't allot you an apartment or whatever. But those days are over, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I may be more thinking of like the 80s and 90s, but yeah, it's good that you mentioned that they're also a product of like copying the Soviet system. And yeah, I remember thinking that when later in the novel, where a lot of the stuff we've been talking about does happen later in the novel. But yeah, when the Chinese show up, it's when the Chinese show up as a group rather than as individuals, it's as the party or the government coming to
Right.
with like their nation building project, let's say. And I was thinking as I was reading, it's like you could come in as maybe a naive reader or a reader who doesn't know too much about China at the time, or someone who has their kind of head in the sand when it comes to communist states. But if you wanted to, in the book, if you wanted to read these officials as just misguided people pursuing a pretty benign socialist cause of providing housing, healthcare, infrastructure for people who previously never had them, like the Evenki, you could read them as people who are doing maybe they're doing the wrong thing, but they have, at least as far as their intentions and their goals are concerned, there's nothing sinister. They're just trying to improve people's lives. But I think you're right to point out that that's quite likely not the whole story, and that might be because of the limits of what you can get published in China in Chinese.
Or possibly even, how Zijian sees things. I don't know.
Right,
But
exactly.
but there is one thing I think is really quite striking uh, about the arrival of any of these Han Chinese who are from the state, which is just extremely ironical. I want to bring it up
Mm.
because there's a word in Evenki. It's called the urireng, which is spelled Urireng, and you can Google that word actually. And it means it's basically it's the clan that is living a collective lifestyle, and uh, it also refers to their campsite. It's a clan living together. It's the basic self-supporting unit in Evenki culture. It's the village, and it's a collective style of life. And
Mm.
to me, the incredible irony is that the cadres come up thinking, they want to talk the Evenki into stopping their hunting, moving down to fixed residence, and this and that, and because they need to begin living a socialist style of life.
Mm.
And the irony there is that they're living the ultimate
Right.
socialist collective lifestyle. So, for instance, you're 45, you're a male. Your job in life is to go out and hunt moose, but for some reason, you're crippled, whatever, you can't do it. So you're back in the camp, helping the women prepare the food or whatever. But when they bring that moose back, you get a nice slice of it. There was no private property. among them. So later on, under the collectivization in the 50s and so on, the herd was no longer theirs. It belonged to the state. And eventually, they had to do things like uh, they used to cut the antlers off, for instance, and go and trade them for all sorts of things they needed. A horse, um, pans made, with iron and so on, which they couldn't deal with. And now they had to take all of those antlers and sell them to the state in the same way that a farmer would have to farm land that was not his, particularly during the People's Commune. So that's the 50s until the late 70s.
Mm.
Nothing belonged to you, everything belonged to the state. And yet, here were these people that were already living a very collective lifestyle. So it's pretty ironic. And I thought that Zijian did a pretty good a pretty good way of making that pretty clear.
This was something I was thinking about. Another conversation I was having with my girlfriend is different families' sensibilities about personal property or private property or what have you. She's telling me like in her family, basically everything in the house belonged to one person, unless it was something like, I don't know, like the forks in the drawer. But I felt that there was a territoriality about property there that wasn't in my family, and it occurred to me, yes, some families might be even more sherry than my own, and vice versa. And yeah, the this relates to last quarter of the moon, because the tribe kind of operate as one big family, and they're a family who, as in the ideal version of socialism or communism or what have you. Yeah, they look out for each other. No one slacks off, but if someone can't contribute as much, they're still cared for, and so on. And you've kind of reminded me of that one academic article I read by Du Lanlan. I remember as I was reading it, feeling annoyed that she didn't use. It was like a critique of the domination of the environment and so on, but she never uses the word capitalism, and she never says socialism or communism either. I was looking for like, okay, when is she going to talk about an economic system? But she didn't. She just used the word domination. And yeah, now that I kind of am looking back on it, that's a decent kind of way of looking at it, because although the revolutionary Chinese state is they're trying to bring about what they think is a better world, but it's done by domination. It's top down. So yeah, it's a far less ideal vision of equality than the tribe, like you were saying. I feel like this is something we could probably go on about for a long time. But I'm just going to ask you one more question about the book proper before we get on to translation. Maybe we've already had our answer early in our conversation, but which parts of the book really affected you deeply? Because it's that sort of book, I think. It's kind of aiming to affect you at various points.
Yeah, I made a note about okay.
Mm.
I think probably the doomed romance between uh, the narrator's mother and Nidu, the shaman.
Yeah.
Uh,
So quite near the
you
start.
know, before her mother gets married, of course, Nidu, the shaman, is courting her, and ends up losing her in a duel, if you like, with his brother, and then once the narrator's father dies, he would like to Nidu the shaman would like to continue that romance, and it's not permitted
Right.
according to custom, and so he knits her an absolutely beautiful skirt made of feathers of all sorts of birds, which she loves. But our narrator makes fun of her mother, so much fun of her when she wears that skirt that she almost never wears it again, puts it away, and that I just thought it was a great story. It goes on for quite a while throughout the book. It's just unrequited love, and it shows you a very negative side of their society.
Right.
That nobody ever says you can't do this, but it's very clear that you cannot. It will not be tolerated.
Mm-hmm.
And you feel in the end that her mother dies, um, not having been able to follow her heart, and that struck me as very well written and very moving. Yeah.
Yeah, we
Of course,
painted. Sorry.
the other parts were particularly when the shamaness's children are taken away as a price for some good she's done for someone who's sick or needed her help. And that's also quite moving and
Mm,
quite eerie because she has this feeling that something's going to happen.
yeah, and then it does. Yeah, I think it was good you pointed out that there are like some limitations to the Evenki tribe in the story, because we've kind of sung their praises for being connected with nature in a way that other modern citizens of modernity aren't. We've sung their praises for having a really good egalitarian approach to property and welfare and what have you. But yeah, there are some what you might call conservative or repressive aspects to how they do things. And I think it's interesting you pointed out nothing's explicitly not allowed, but there are things which should not be done. It reminds me, remember around that time of my life when I was trying to obsessed with labels of belief systems, one of the things I read about was anarchism, and like the obvious the obvious criticism you'd make of someone who wants to get rid of all hierarchies and systems of rules is, well, how are you going to stop bad or malicious behavior? And from what I remember, the best answer an anarchist, a really sincere and radical, I suppose, anarchist would tell you is, oh well, anyone who's malicious would be ostracized. So anyone who steals or doesn't contribute when they can, or commits what in a normal society would be a crime, they'll just be shunned. And I guess you can kind of make the argument that's what's happening in or the threat that the shaman would have there is that, okay, he doesn't break a written law, but if he pursues the unrequited love too far, it's game over as far as his place in the group is concerned.
And of course he's the leader once his brother dies. He's pretty much the leader of the clan, but he's just not permitted to do that. Yeah, and what's really going on here is that Zijian is suggesting that even before the Han Chinese arrived and took away their forest and eventually their way of life, that these people may well have been doomed because of the way they related to one another.
Mm.
And there's a lot of negativism and nastiness among the characters as you go along. And then I have a Spanish friend who has lived in Yunnan for 30 years or so, and more or less of an anthropologist. And he was shocked by how many people end up dying, violently or very unpleasantly in the second half of the book. And that is also part of what she's talking about. Yes, ecologically, these people were pushed out by the Chinese who wanted their timber, but they had problems, and their isolation meant that they couldn't take care of themselves sometimes, and they were also psychologically bearing down on and shunning other members of their group. So there's more than one factor there. It's not a simple black and white thing.
Yeah, totally.
They're
Like,
demonized. I mean, yeah.
like does our condition as modern, people in modernity drive us mad? Quite possibly, but would we want to throw it all away? Probably not. I quite like living in a house and having internet, even if who knows what the internet does to my brain. Probably a lot of not great stuff, but would I get rid of it? Maybe not. So let's on I don't know why I'm ending talking about the book by some sort of throwaway comment about the internet, but that's what I'm doing. So let's move on to the next section. That's technical questions. So in this case, questions about translation, because you're the translator of the book. So you should have a thing or two to say. Something you stressed to me when we first got talking were the differences between the original title in Chinese and the English title that the book had in its publication in translation. So can you break down each title for us?
Oh, it's pretty easy, really.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, what happened was that the Chinese is the literal translation is the right bank of the Argun, the right side of this river, as opposed to left, right? So the right bank of the Argun, that's really what is called the Argunakli Yuan. So basically, what happened was that I translated an excerpt. Great Tan of based in Taiwan, a very good agent. He sold the book very quickly. Simon and Schuster bought it. Excuse me, Harville Secker bought it. It was actually published later on by Simon and Schuster.
Right.
And they waited a while to hire me to translate it. In the meantime, the Italians put out the book. They found somebody to translate it, came out. And the Italian name, the title for the book, it was La Ultima Quarto de Luna. Okay, the last quarter of the moon, right? And it in a Romance language, it rhymes, right?
Right.
But in English, so then what happened was they were trying to figure out how to translate it, and they came up with it. They translated the Italian name, the last quarter of the moon. And I said to them, that doesn't say anything about China. It doesn't say anything about the Evenki. It doesn't say anything about their environment, the Argonne or the Amur or the Heilongjiang or whatever. And they were just sold on it. They liked the sound, and so that's what they ran with. And I found it kind of funny, but looking back on it, I don't really feel that the publisher quite understood what this book was about. And, they insisted on publishing it in hardcover, which there was just really no need. I mean, it's the readership is people interested in ethnicities, anthropology, sociology, a good tale about something about China that you really wouldn't have thought of. But there's nothing in the title that gives you any idea that says anything to do with China or the borderlands of China. So I thought that was a big mistake. It has been translated now into, as I said, Dutch, Japanese, whatever, and it's about half and half. Some of those titles are the translation of the words "right bank of the Argonne," while the other ones go with "last quarter of the moon." So that's the story there.
Would you be mad at me if I said I think Last Quarter of the Moon is a really beautiful book title?
No, of course not. I think it's great. Who am I? I'm just a translator.
Right.
Great.
Yeah, I think I see what your point, because the Argonne River, you have a geographic place name there in the title, and it relates to the Evenki. So there's a good what's the word? There's a good rationale there for that one. I think if the problem with the rationale for me is I wouldn't really. I mean, I suppose I might know now where the Argonne is. I was involved. I helped out in publishing a book which had a great big map concerning the borders of China. So I labeled that river a few times. But if I hadn't done that, even me, someone who lived in China, would be like, Argonne, where could that be? And I would guess most English language readers, they know it's a river, but that's because it says right bank. They might they might have no idea where that's pointing to. But I can appreciate how vexing this can be, because the work I do with the publisher, whenever we decide that we don't want to go with a literal, because we did a lot of translated Chinese books, and whenever we decide we don't want to go with the literal translation of the Chinese name, on one part of me thinks, oh, fantastic, we can have deep discussions and be creative, and the other part of me thinks, oh no, not this again.
But there's one thing that's undeniable. I mean, I've been the editor of many magazines and a few books and so on, and it's undeniable that by choosing Last Quarter of the Moon, that you have not provided the reader with anything, any clue that this has to do with China.
Mm.
And actually, what I said to Zijian at the time was, well, that's good in that they're trying to market this as fiction,
Right. Mm-hmm.
and not as Chinese anthropological whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Fine. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tricky thing. Even on this podcast, I mean, the clues in the name is a Chinese fiction podcast. But I think there's a temptation to analyze everything through like a national lens, or a geographic lens or political lens, anything that can make it about China. But often a lot of the really meaningful stuff you can get out of a conversation about these books avoids that kind of thing that you're magnetically drawn to and treating the book as fiction. And I think one reason why that's so fruitful is for a lot of your average readers, that's what's in their mind when they pick up the book, because
Right.
not
They're not
everyone.
buying
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. Okay, here's the next technical question. This one's not actually about translation, it's about research. So you mentioned that you talked a bit with Zijian. Did you have to do a lot of your own research, and did you have to consult with her much?
Right. Okay. Well, first of all, consult with her. No. Uh, in two areas. One is that her Chinese was extremely clear,
Right.
quite simple, and so when I translated, say, Shanghai Baby, or some of the stuff I did, say, on Chinese painting and so on, technical words and all, I need to get back to the author. For this, no. Okay. So I did ask her one thing, and I was quite disappointed about what she said. There are about 125 words in the novel, which are Evenki words.
Mm.
So I was just talking to her about it, and wondering if she could recommend someone to me, some in Evenki, so that I could get some insight into these words, particularly how they're pronounced in Evenki. And she said, well, why don't you just use Pinyin, Romanized Chinese?
Boo.
I thought, oh no, I think you didn't hear me. In
Mm.
other words, these people don't speak Chinese.
Right.
That's not their world. So when I got the Italian version, which came out before I did much of the translation, I was shocked to find that the Italian version did use most of the time just simply Romanized forms, transliterations from the Chinese.
Right.
And this really bothered me, because this is a people and a culture under threat, and a language. And there's only 30,000 of them in China. And probably today, the children, say, under 20, are probably speaking more Chinese now than they are Evenki. So it seemed to me it was part of my mission to make sure that those 125 words were adequately conveyed. So I spent a lot of time and some of my own money trying to locate people who either were Evenki or who knew Evenki people, so that I could find out how each of these words was pronounced in Evenki. Then I would have the option of transliterating from the Evenki sound rather than the Chinese sound. So that was quite an adventure. I probably spent, I don't know, a fifth of my entire translation time tracking these people down, and it was very interesting. I found probably the authority, a Dr. Tao Ke, that's his Chinese name. He is Evenki, and he didn't speak he didn't speak Chinese until I think he was a teenager. So he grew up in a village,
Right.
and he got a PhD in Japanese linguistics. Brilliant fellow. Now very fully employed at the Chinese Academy of what is it? The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Extremely prestigious. These are where the anthropologists and archaeologists and sociologists of China, work. So I found him, which was not easy. And I said, I've got these 125 words, and you can break them down into three categories. One is place names, one is names of the characters in the book, and then there are these words that are used to describe various aspects of Evenki culture. And I said, I'd love to have you transliterate them for me. And long and short of it was, he didn't really have the time to do that. And so in the end, he did about 1/3 of them. Most of the words have had to do with things like the word for village, or the word for a mouth harp, or the word for various fruits or animals. That was very, very useful. But because he wasn't able to do all of them, so I had to go out and find other people. And I found some very interesting people. I found an American of Tajikistan, of Tajik
Right.
background, who had by himself, he was a dealer in junk bonds in Hong Kong.
Goodness.
Unbelievable. Who was running a blog. He launched a blog called something like "Why Living in Hong Kong but Not Learning Cantonese." I don't know how I hit upon this guy, but he learned quite a bit of Mongolian and Russian on his own.
Interesting.
And Chinese. He's 26, brilliant guy. So the reason I wanted to deal with him was that the best dictionaries, bilingual or trilingual glossaries or dictionaries, have not been compiled by the Chinese. They've been compiled by the Japanese and by the Russians. So of the words that Dr. Tao could not help me with, or it just didn't seem quite right, he was able to look at the Russian dictionary and say, no, it's this word, it comes from that, this is how you pronounce it. So that was brilliant. I found a Uyghur, living in Shanghai, who happened to have been to the homeland of the Evenki up in Siberia and so on. And so he knew some of the place names, at least in Russian. And he also had Uyghur friends, so that was useful. For the place names, I came across a brilliant book, which was put together, maybe 10, 15 years ago by a committee of Evenki, who know Chinese, scholars. It had something like 8,000 place names.
Wow.
Imagine, you're talking about Manchuria, which is the three northeasternmost provinces of China, and a fairly small area of Russia up to Lake Baikal and Siberia. 8,000 place names. So this is a people who, obviously there were a lot more than before, and a very rich, whatever. So, and it was written in Chinese, but it gave you the transliteration of each place name. So I used a lot of those. And then the third group was the names of the characters. And that's interesting because some of the characters have names that are obviously Russian.
Right.
Changed, not fully Russian, or not the full Russian name, but maybe the shorter name that a Russian might use in, among his friends and among his relatives. And so to find out how those names, which of those names were Russian, which of them were really Evenki, and how to pronounce all of them in Evenki, I found Gu Tao's sister-in-law, and she went and showed this list of the names in Chinese to Evenkis. They said, oh, well, this one is Russian, this one is Evenki, and this is how you pronounce it. So I spent a lot of time on that and money, and didn't regret it at all. Loved it because it just seemed to me very important to do it. And I refused to simply use, Hanyu Pinyin. One other thing about this that I did, which some people would find maybe extreme or even wrong, was that I decided that some of the city names that in the novel, towns really, and small villages and so on, that were given in Chinese, that was not on, because I don't think before the early 50s that very many of the Evenki spoke Chinese very well. Of course, well enough to trade and to deal occasionally with whatever Chinese they met. But they were pretty isolated, and they were doing a lot more with the Russians and Mongolians than they were with the Chinese. So when I found that there were Evenki names for those places, instead of using the Chinese name, I used Evenki. And that seemed to me, sort of true to the Evenki, if not exactly true to Zijian's version. So there you are.
Right.
But
Fascinating.
I figured it didn't make a big difference because for the most part they weren't big cities. So even the
Mm,
Chinese know where they are.
right. Okay.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Really, really, really fascinating. I got the feeling you might have done something like that, but now to know the details and the story and the people that you spoke to, fascinating.
So, but
Yeah.
let me answer something else. So you
Yeah.
said, what kind of research did I do? I
Mm,
did a
mm,
lot of research. I did not do something as some people said. Well, did you go there? No, I did not. Yeah, too
mm.
bad. Whatever. But I watched Gutau's videos, and I got a version that may not even be commercially available now. And so I saw all the people speaking and singing and drinking together and everything. Gave me a very strong feeling about them. And one of the things I want to focus, I want to emphasize, is that almost all the pictures on Gutau's northern hunting culture, and of course in his videos and everything, are of this one clan. So this is the clan. Let me spell it out. It's Aogu Augulaya. AoguLaya. I'm sorry, Luya. These are the people that were visited by TrChFic. So once you've seen some of the videos and you've seen the pictures, you've definitely seen some of the people that she was thinking about as models
Mm.
for the
Wow.
book, including the narrator.
Right.
And TrChFic was asked if this woman, who's now must be over 100, and as far as I know, is still living in the mountains, if she had interviewed her and based the narrator on her, and she said absolutely not. But certainly some of the characters in the book were more or less based on some of these people, their character traits and so on. So that's really neat. Okay, so the last kind of research I did, which just went on and on and on. I must have printed out 300 or 400 sheets of paper from online, Russians, anthropologists, whatever, all about the history and culture of the Evenki. And I read all that. Some of it was in Chinese, a lot of it was in English, and so on. And all in all, I consulted, I think, 3 dictionaries or glossaries. One was Mongolian, Evenki, and Chinese, and then through this Tajik fellow, Russian, and then the Japanese also. I did get a hold of one of their glossaries. All these languages, I don't know Mongolian, but I can read out Russian, and I know Japanese well enough to take a look at this stuff. And really, it was quite well done. And the essays on their culture, it was just endless and brilliant. A lot of
Mm.
it was written by people, say, uh, who have done research on the Sami, who are an Arctic people, a similar lifestyle to the Evenki in Sweden. So yeah, I did a tremendous amount of that kind of stuff,
Mm.
and it seemed to me, from what I read in the book, that TrChFic, she definitely did her homework. She
Yeah.
was able to find these 125 words that were Evenki, and they all were Evenki, and the way she portrayed the people and their lifestyle, it was pretty impressive.
Fantastic. Well, I thought this was some kind of deep question when I was writing it. I now realize this is probably dwarfed by everything you've just described. But one of the first times I thought about this sort of issue where translation in relation to the Minzu, the ethnic groups of China. So there's an anecdote you can find in a few different places online from Howard Goldblatt, whose translations have popped up a few times on the show. So he was the guy that translated Wolf Totem, and he has said publicly at talks and stuff, he had a few disagreements with Jiang Rong, the author. They had a good relationship, but sometimes a bit rocky because of their disagreements. And there was a thing on the very first page of his translation that set Jiang Rong off, and that's the character Han. So Han is in Han Chinese. And in the translation of Wolf Totem, in Wolf Totem, how can I say this? The people who are coming into Inner Mongolia from the interior of China, they don't get referred to as like Zhongguoren or something. They're referred to as Han, I guess, Hanren. So Han people or Han Chinese people. And in Goldblatt's translation, he basically just simplified that to Chinese. So everyone in the story pretty much. No, everyone in the story is a Chinese citizen, but the Mongolian ethnicity people are referred to as Mongols, and the Han people are referred to as Chinese. So if you're not familiar with China, actually my girlfriend read the book, and she knows a bit about China now because of me, but she didn't twig until quite far through that the story was happening in Inner Mongolia, a Chinese province, and not Mongolia. So this is all a preamble to ask you about how you did the translation, because you used the word Han in your translation, and I'm guessing that's a direct translation from Zijian's original Chinese. So what I want to ask is, what difference do you see in your rationale there and Goldblatt's?
Yeah, as I recall, I translated this book a few years ago, but I don't believe she ever referred to them as Zhongguoren, as Chinese. So maybe just very simply, I remember they used quite a bit Hanren, just Han person, a Han, which actually is. When I was in Yunnan, we don't refer to Chinese as Chinese. We call it the language of the Han. And of course, many people in Yunnan, they're not Han Chinese. So in the northeast, I assume is the same thing. Right? So I'm not sure that I meant anything terribly deep by it, but I would say that I didn't feel that the Evenki perceived the Han as Chinese or members of a Chinese nation, because they were living in the mountains. Very few of them ever left the mountains, being near the river and their herds and everything. They weren't traveling around, outside of the greater Khingan mountains. So these people that they met up with, there were some anda, which is, Russian for friend, and they spoke Russian with them, or some Russian, or the Russians spoke Evenki with them, or Mongolian. So the Han were just another of the peoples that occasionally appeared in their lives, and there weren't all that many of them until the late 40s and then the 50s. So I'm not sure that the only reference to the Chinese Empire was their ideas about the Manchu, and the Evenki, although not in the book, the Evenki actually were recruited by the Manchus into a banner to fight for the Qing dynasty. But the Manchus were seen as their cousins, not as Chinese. So it just never occurred to me to call them Chinese, because Chinese would mean they were from a country called China, and China didn't exist for these people. There were villages where you traded this or that, and big city, larger towns where you went to, buy a horse, or buy something to store during the winter so you didn't starve to death, or to get liquor. But there was no China. So why would these people be Chinese?
Yeah, makes sense.
That's right. But the other thing is that beginning in 2009 and up right up until now. I've been hosting a blog, and for a long time, the name of the blog was, or the slug line was, writing writing in Chinese by and about non-Han peoples. So the whole idea of launching the blog was to focus on the lives and consciousness of people who are not Han. So, of course, those people often refer to the Chinese as Han and don't necessarily have a strong sense of being a nation, a member of a nation called China.
Yeah, I mean, I bring this one up quite a lot on the show, and I always stress it's an analogy, and all analogies are ropey, and this is a very ropey analogy. But I think of like the UK, where the people who are most specific about what the word English means are the non-English. So if you ask an English person what's the difference between English and England and Britain, they'll be able to give you like a technical answer, but there might be like they'll be like, huh? But you know, those two things are synonyms. Whereas like if you ask someone in Scotland, like, is there a difference between England and
They're
Britain?
not synonyms.
Yeah, they're not synonyms. Yeah. And like, of course, like that is the technically accurate definition because England is one territory in the country, but it just happens to be, you know, it's in a dominant enough position that culturally, like, what is the difference between English and British culture? I don't know that. Maybe there is not very much difference at all. Maybe it's a stupid thing to even think about. But at least, like, in the definition of each word, they are different. But that's most apparent to the non-English rather than the English. But yeah, I'll try not to make it any more about my own identity because I do that enough on the show already, and it's irrelevant, really. Yeah, so there's all our translation related questions. Let's get on to the silly fun ones now. So I always do I try to always do, and I'm getting better at it now, having a word of the day for each episode. And obviously it's always been a Chinese word of the day. But if you think it would be fun, could you suggest an Evenki word of the day? Or if you like, we could do both. We could do a Chinese word of the day and an Evenki word of the day.
No, yeah, I have no Chinese word at all. This is not
Okay.
about Chinese. I think I would probably think of a word I brought up, which is urireng.
Udirang.
Which is both the clan that's living together and the camp where they live, and which is really their home and the center of their lives. The urireng is very, very important to them, and unthinkable that one would leave it. And so, for instance, when we're talking about Nidu, the shaman, he wouldn't be able to survive psychologically if he were put outside of the urireng. And from an anthropological point of view, it's a clan. Yeah, so that's the basic unit, rather than the what in the West we refer to the family as mom and dad and the kids, and it's not the same idea. Yeah.
So in these word of the days, and I always put them in the show notes, and I always put the English. Well, usually it goes. I put the Chinese characters, the pinyin, and the English translation. And for this one, correct me if I'm wrong, but in your English translation, you don't translate udirang. You just have it as a loan word, I suppose, from
Right.
Evenki, and it's in is it I forgot. Is it italicized or not italicized?
Well, all of the words which were which I thought of as being evocative of or descriptive of Evenki culture, I italicized all of them.
Right. That's right. So if I'm going to put a translation of udirang, well, should I put clan, or do you think it's kind of an untranslatable concept?
Well, it's both. It is the the temporary living space of a clan. So encampment, village, but it's also it's not just an encampment because it's the clan's encampment.
Ah, right. Okay. So it can describe the kind of social group and also the place the social group is present
Right.
in. I've phrased that in really clunky scientific language, but yeah. So I'll maybe in my show notes I'll put something like clan slash camping ground. Camping ground. Did you say what was the term you used?
Okay. Well, I'll say it again, but I looked
Yeah.
up today and I saw the technical definition of this word is a clan living together, the basic self-supporting unit of Evenki culture. But
There we go.
right. But to me, reading the book, the clan and the place are inseparable.
Got it. Okay.
So they wouldn't if one of them met up, in Beijing with the other, it'd say, they couldn't just say we're if they said we're in the same urireng, it's like Karos in I forget that author's name. For me, reading the book, it seemed very clear that it's where the clan lived together, both the place and their relationship. And that's the neat thing about using the Evenki rather than explaining it. So there's a little background to
Right.
this. The Kite Runner, which I wrote about, the translation of which I wrote about in 2009. It was one of the first things I ever put up my blog, and it got thousands and thousands of hits, even up till now. I also had about 150 Afghan words in it, Dari, Pushtu, whatever. And I thought that both Zijian and the author of The Kite Runner handled these words very well. And what they did was, generally speaking, they just threw them in the middle, almost as if you were a native speaker, and never said, it was never in brackets, oh, this means the clan. It was woven in the story, and they use it several times, and it becomes pretty clear after a while what it means. And I think that's a great thing to do for your readers, because it stretches the brain a little. And it reminds you, okay, yeah, I'm reading this in, probably my mother tongue, it's Chinese or it's English, but these people, we don't speak the same language. And yet now I understand.
I have had an experience of reading a translated Chinese book or two, and the translator has, or perhaps the editor, but probably the translator has opted to give us a loan word from Chinese, which they put in italics, but then explain in brackets, give us a definition of the word. And it makes me want to bang my head against the wall, because it feels like I'm reading a textbook and not a piece of fiction. Although that said, when it's in footnote at the bottom, for some reason that's fine with me. But yeah, it is
if
there's
a glossary or something at the end of the time, that's great. And I wanted to have one, and the publisher wouldn't do it. But I thought that the way she did it was good, and I felt, in a sense, that I made it even better by making sure that the pronunciation was as close to Evenki as possible.
Yeah, I think it gave me some confidence in the book as I was reading it. So I think that was a good choice. I worry we're getting quite serious again. So here is another silly question. Right. If last quarter of the moon was a drink, and it could be hot or cold, hard or soft, what drink do you think it would be?
I think it really should be a sour yogurt drink made from reindeer milk.
And last in the kind of miscellaneous question slot here, it's your self-promo slot. You mentioned a blog. What is the name of that blog? How can the listeners find it?
Okay. I have 3 ways you can find me. First of all, you can just Google me. Yeah. So if you Google Bruce Humes, you'll definitely find my blog. I mean, it'll come up on the first page of Google. But my blog is, www.bruce-humes.com. And the problem there is that I've just moved it to WordPress, and so it's really a mess. So I would recommend to readers that they either click on, at the very top, there's something called Translation Services. And if you go there, you'll see all the translations I've done. I have a lot of links, right? Or on the home page there's something called blog categories. And so you could click on last quarter of the moon, or you could even just go to the search window and type in, last quarter of the moon, and all sorts of things about last quarter of the moon would pop up. They wouldn't today, but they will later. The reason they wouldn't today is that all of the URLs have changed, but I'll change them. And then thirdly, you can find the things about me on Amazon. I mean, I've translated several books, or kobo.com.
Yeah, I was just going to say, some of my research for this episode was done right on your blog. There's some really interesting further reading about Last Quarter of the Moon and other coverage of it and stuff. So yeah, and all sorts of things. If anyone's feeling very interested in what Bruce has done regarding like the other ethnicities within China and its borders, is just an absolute smorgasbord of stuff there. So it's great blog. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about, like recent publications or things you're working on now?
The last book I did and the one that I'm doing now, they're both about the Silk Road. One of them is Silk Road culture. So I'm finishing off a book now, which is called Silk Road Civilizations, 15 Talks. So this is he was born in China, born in Shenyang, which is in Manchuria before, grew up in Taiwan. He's Manchu.
Right.
And he kind of unbelievably studied something in biomedicine, definitely in the sciences, and worked in it for like 50 years, but became very interested in the Silk Road and has pretty much followed it all the way from China to various places in Europe and Turkey, and has talked about how Chinese culture basically, moved along the Silk Road in Eurasia. And I guess the other thing I could tell you, I've been reading two books. One of them is called 5 Women Who Loved Love, which is a fairly erotic collection of short stories by Japan's Saikaku Ihara, and something a little closer to what we've been talking about. Just got it the other day on my Kindle. It's called Land of Strangers. And it's by a fellow who specializes in Chatagai language. His name is Eric Schlüssel. Just came out a few days ago.
Right.
So Chagatai is a now extinct Turkic language, but it was once spoken very widely in Central Asia, basically as a result of the Mongol invasion. And what's interesting about it is that he studied with Mark Elliott. Mark Elliott is a sinologist known perhaps most for being a proponent of what's called New Qing history. And the New Qing history people are interesting because basically they took the time to learn, most of them at any rate, took the time to learn to read Manchu. So they've gone back and come up with all sorts of different views of Qing history, because if you only read the Chinese, you'll get certain knowledge and certain angles, if you like. But if you read, particularly in the earlier time, when they were still when the rulers really were still fluent in Manchu, say someone like Kangxi, Kangxi was fluent in both Chinese and Manchu, and he wrote a lot of stuff in Manchu. So the New Qing historians basically come up with ideas that clash with a lot of the Han-centric view of the Chinese Empire. So Eric Schlüssel has gone and learned a language that also very few Chinese scholars know. That's Chagatai, which is more or less the prototype for, say, Uyghur. Yeah.
Right.
So that means that he's been able to, over the years, read maybe hundreds, perhaps thousands of documents that were written in a Central Asian language, about Xinjiang, about the stands. And Land of Strangers, what he's done is he's taken this period, I think it's about 1870 to the early 20th century, when China really was trying to colonize Xinjiang. For a long time, basically, the Manchus just let the Uyghurs and the other locals, Kazakhs, the Mongols, the Hui, get on with running their own show in Xinjiang. And there were Han Chinese there, but they were definitely a minority. And then along came this army from Hunan, and they moved into Turpan, which is a major city in Xinjiang. And he goes apparently into detail about the daily lives of people in Xinjiang, which is something that very few historians tend to deal with. It's normally politics, the big events, the battles, and he could do this because he knows Chagatai and Chinese. So I have high expectations for this book. It should be fun.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I typed Chagatai and I can see there is a Wikipedia wormhole just waiting for me to jump in at some point. Really interesting. Yeah, so that was going to be your last question. What you're reading now? So that means I'm all out of questions.
Right.
So yeah, I guess it's time for me to say thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been enlightening.
Well, I enjoyed it. I didn't know we were going to end up talking about animism. I think that's
yeah. I don't know if it showed up at your end or if the listeners will catch it. But when I was going on my great big long rant there about one's relationship with the universe and the cats and the geese and stuff, maybe I'm just having a weird week, but I was getting a bit emotional there. But yeah, that just speaks to the power of the book, I suppose, and the magic of literature, although it sounds very corny when I say it like that. But yeah, again, thanks. It was a fun chat, I agree. Alright, we've reached the end of the episode. I had a great time chatting with Bruce. I hope that you guys had a great time listening in on that chat by the magic of the internet. Certainly a lot of fun for me. So before the MP3 file hits its very last second, I'm going to give you the plugs. So don't forget what I told you at the start of the show. If you want to support the show, follow the support link in the show notes. If you can't see the show notes, if you're using iTunes and it's the shortened version, then go to the TrChFic homepage, trchfic.podbean.com, and the support link is at the top right there. It's a hammer and a mallet. That's that other hammer-like object whose name I couldn't recall. So there's a little icon of a hammer and a mallet, and next to that text that says help support TrChFic, and the text is in the Josephine Sans font, which is my favourite font, by the way. So remember, there's the Patreon, there is TrChFic Deluxe, there's PayPal, and there's Buy Me a Coffee. I think you guys don't want to hear all that again. So yeah, that's how you can support me. Another thing that is on the podcast homepage now, which is pretty cool, are tags. I've added the little tags widget that Podbean has. Plugin, sorry, not a widget. So if you scroll down along the left-hand side of the page, you'll see a load of tags saying things like all crime episodes, all sci-fi episodes, all wuxia episodes, all solo episodes, novellas set in Shanghai, Taiwanese writers, and yeah, so those are a fun way of kind of browsing episodes by topic. And if you're a listener who's like only interested in the sci-fi episodes, which is pretty reasonable, because it is a very popular niche, and I know that it does describe some of you guys, there's a tag that will isolate all those for you. So yeah, very handy if you ask me. It was a very clever guy who made those tags. I think he deserves lots of money and praise. So yeah, thanks to him. Feedback. If you heard something that you did not like or did not agree with, or something that you did like and want to say, I like that a lot, then please do tell me more. I'd love to hear like what your favorite episodes were. If me or my guest got something wrong and you want to correct it, I would love to hear all of that. That would be extremely useful, and you know, it's engagement makes me happy. So yeah, if you want to engage with the show, i.e. talk to me, you can use social media. Twitter, Instagram, and Discord are kind of the go-to places. So the show's Twitter is just my own one, that is @AngusLikesWords. The show's Instagram is at TrChFic, TrChFic, and we have a Discord where you can share your thoughts or meet other listeners of the show, talk to them, blah blah blah. Discord's been pretty quiet lately. I'll be honest about that, but yeah, that's a great place to share your thoughts because you won't just be sharing them with me, you'll be sharing them with other listeners. So a lot of potential in the Discord, even if it's kind of crickets and tumbleweed there just now. Those are all our generic little bullet points that I have to hit for the plugs. You probably know what's coming now. It's the best thing you can do for the show, and that's spread the word. So if you know someone who might be interested, tell them. Even give them the link. That would be even better. And of course, tell your teachers, tell your reindeer, tell your anda, your local Russian trader that you sell all the reindeer, not hoofs. What are the things that grow from reindeer heads? Antlers. My girlfriend's laughing at me. Sell your reindeer. The guy that you sell the reindeer antlers to, tell him about the show. And your local shaman or shamaness, obviously, because they have a lot of influence on the natural world. So if we can get all the sparrows and the beavers and the wolves listening to the podcast, that'll really boost my numbers. That'd be excellent. So please do that. And until the next episode, Zijian.